Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Demoniality, or Incubi and Succubi, by Father Ludovico Maria Sinistrari, and I'm sure somebody who actually knows how to pronounce his name just committed suicide right now. I apologize. Now, this is a really interesting book. It was actually discovered in 1872 as a Latin manuscript, and it was discovered in some bookshop in London in 1872 by a French scholar named Isidore Liseux. And once again, I'm sure somebody who actually knows how to pronounce his name just killed himself right now. I am sorry. And this was actually a Latin manuscript written sometime in the 17th century by Father Sinistrari, but it was discovered by Isidore Liseux, who translated it to French, and I believe English as well. This, of course, is obviously an English translation, and he published it in, I want to say, 1879. And in case you couldn't tell from the cover right here, this is obviously a modern-day printing of the book. So, the book was written in the 17th century, but it wasn't actually discovered and published until the 19th century. Now, demoniality, if I'm saying that word right, or Incubi and Succubi, is essentially a long essay written by Father Sinistrari on the subject of demoniality, which essentially means, this is boiling it down, but it essentially means intercourse with demons. Now, an incubus, according to most legends, is a demon that has intercourse with humans, typically human women, and a succubus is the female version of this. So once again, this is essentially a long essay on the subject of incubi and succubi, and in this, Father Sinistrari goes into great detail about what exactly he thinks these creatures are. And he also tells 3 stories in this that he claims to be true stories of people that he met who have had encounters with incubi and succubi. One of these stories he actually claims to have been witness to. Now, I actually first found out about this book because of horror author Whitley Schreiber. Now, Whitley Schreiber is an author who has written both fiction and non-fiction books, and he actually claims to have been abducted by aliens in the past, and in 1987 he published the book Communion, which is about his supposed extraterrestrial encounters. Now, in that book, Whitley Schreiber theorizes that what if all these stories that have been told throughout human history about encounters with demons or ghosts or fairies or angels were actually encounters with alien beings? And there's a certain point in Communion where he makes reference to this book, which is how I first found out about this book. Now, Demoniality really is a fascinating book, and what's really interesting about this book is the fact that Father Sinistrari uses what, for the time, would have been considered logic to explain the existence of these creatures. Now, obviously, reading it from a 21st century perspective, his logic is a joke, but back then, he actually comes up with logical and arguably scientific explanations, at least scientific for the time, because this was the 17th century, so we did not have the knowledge of science that we have now, but he comes up with logical and arguably scientific explanations behind the existence of incubi and succubi, and he comes to these conclusions that these creatures do in fact exist using what, once again, for the time would have been considered logic, but obviously reading it now in the 21st century, you realize that yeah, most of this is a joke now, but back then this was really serious. Like, back then, people genuinely believed in this stuff. Now, to be fair, there are people even today who still believe in the existence of ghosts and demons, and I actually do have some religious beliefs. I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to get too detailed into what my own personal religion is, but because I have some religious beliefs, I would like to think that makes me open-minded enough to accept the possibility of ghosts and demons actually being able to invade our plane of existence, but I don't believe in them in the same way that's presented in this book, because in this book he also talks about like goblins and fairies and stuff like that, and all that's like fairy tale stuff. Like, I believe that if ghosts and demons do in fact exist, I don't personally believe they can really affect stuff in the physical world, at least not to the same extent that he describes in this book, because in this book, in one of the stories that he tells, he talks about the incubus actually being able to make physical objects vanish from existence. And from all the ghost documentaries I've watched, and from actual stories I've heard from people I've met who have claimed to have had supernatural experiences, I've always heard of like demons and ghosts being able to like move objects, but I've never heard of a demon or a ghost actually being able to make an object physically disappear. All that's like in the realm of fantasy. So I think when the author talks about it in this book, I personally think he was just exaggerating that part. So once again, I don't doubt the possibility of the existence of ghosts and demons, but not to the same extent that's presented in this book. But it's still a fascinating read, and he goes into great detail about how he believes that incubi and succubi are not necessarily spirits in the traditional sense. Rather, he actually makes the argument that incubi and succubi actually do have physical bodies, but they're not physical bodies in any way that we as humans can fully comprehend. And one thing I thought was really fascinating, especially because he was a priest, was he actually makes the argument that just because something's a demon doesn't automatically make it an abomination to God. He actually makes the argument that some incubi and succubi are actually mortal in some way and can actually be saved. He actually makes the argument that demons, if they repent, can actually get into heaven, and I thought that was fascinating, especially coming from a priest. Like, I've never heard a priest actually say that a demon can get into heaven. So, Demoniality really is an interesting book. I'll admit, it's not necessarily an entertaining book. Like, I could actually see somebody reading this and being quite bored by it, but the thing is, Sinistrari did not write this to be entertaining. He wrote this as more of an essay on the subject, so it wasn't really meant to be entertaining, so I can't really criticize it in that regard, but I do find this to be a really interesting book, and I do recommend it on a historical level, and I don't mean historical as in, oh, all this is real, but when I say historical, I mean, I recommend it if you want to get a real insight into how people thought in the 17th century, then this is a book I would definitely recommend if you want to get an insight into people's mindsets back then. Now, as I mentioned before, in this book, Father Sinistrari tells 3 stories about people who he met in the past who have claimed to have had encounters with incubi or succubi, and those were my favorite sections of this book. Now, of the 3 stories, I want to say that the most compelling was definitely the first story that Sinistrari tells in this book. And when I say compelling, I don't mean compelling as in, oh, the most believable, or I thought this was real, but when I say compelling, I mean just as a story, because the first story that Father Sinistrari tells in this book on its own is actually a genuinely creepy little story that could work as its own story. Now, this first story that Father Sinistrari tells in this book is about a woman whom he met 25 years prior to writing this book, and it's about an experience that this woman allegedly went through. Now, this is a woman whom he describes of being of deep religious faith and of being highly regarded in her community. So, according to the story that he tells in this book, this woman was awoken one night to the sound of a voice professing to be in love with her, and this voice, of course, belonged to an incubus, and this incubus wanted to have sex with her, but she, of course, refused, and throughout the course of the story, the incubus becomes increasingly more violent and more cruel to her, and over the course of a few years, apparently, this incubus has been physically and psychologically tormenting her, and even publicly humiliates her at one point, and nothing seems to work against this incubus. Like, she tries to get an exorcist to bless her home, and nothing seems to keep this incubus away. Now, Whitley Schreiber actually retells this story in his book Communion, and Whitley Schreiber, he theorized that if the protagonist of this story did in fact exist, and if this did really happen to her, his theory is that she was actually the victim of alien visitation, but of course this was the 17th century, and back then, the idea of life being on other planets was not an idea that was in a lot of people's heads at the time, and her being a very religious woman, she's of course going to view her experiences as demonic visitation as opposed to extraterrestrial visitation. Now, these torments that this incubus puts this woman through include molesting her and hitting her, and also playing a series of cruel tricks on her. Like, according to the story, at one point this incubus actually takes these stones and builds this wall around her and her husband's bed as she's sleeping, and then they have to use like a ladder to get out. There's also a point in this story where she's breastfeeding her daughter, and the demon snatches her daughter away and puts her daughter on the roof of her house, but doesn't harm the daughter at all. Also, according to the story, at one point this woman's husband had a bunch of military friends over for dinner, and the incubus caused like the dinner plates and the table to just vanish out of existence. There's also a certain point in the story where you find out that in order to keep the incubus away, she tries wearing a monk's robe and is told to wear it for a period of 12 months, and then one day when she's out in public thinking she'll be safe from the incubus, she goes to a holy mass, and all of a sudden the robe and all her clothes just disappear from her body, leaving her naked in the crowd. But even after all these torments from the demon, she still refuses to give in to this demon. But once again, it's a great story as a story, but I'm not 100% sure if I believe that it's true or not. Like, I personally believe that if this woman did exist, I think she was the victim of mental illness, but as I mentioned before, I don't 100% doubt the existence of ghosts and demons, so for all I know, maybe she was actually visited by some kind of a demonic entity, but all the stuff about objects, like physically vanishing from existence, I believe that was either exaggerated by her when she told Father Sinistrari about this, or it was exaggerated by him when he wrote this. The other story that Sinistrari tells in this book is about a young nun who is being tormented by an incubus, and it's a similar story to the first story that he told, and it is good and it is pretty creepy, but I didn't like it as much as the first story. The third story that he tells in this book is about a young deacon who is being tormented by a succubus, and this is the story that Father Sinistrari claims to have actually been witness to. But yeah, the three stories in this book are definitely my favorite parts of this whole book, and could really be read on their own as standalone stories. But yeah, Demoniality is a fascinating book. Once again, it's not necessarily an entertaining book, with the exception of the three stories that are told. It's mostly an educational book, if you will, even though obviously now we realize that yeah, most of his science and most of his logic is bullshit now, but for its time, it could have come off as being educational, because once again, this was written in the 17th century. And one thing that you could definitely criticize about this book is he wrote this as an essay to prove the existence of incubi and succubi, but you could tell he very much went into this with a predetermined outcome. Like, one of the things that he uses as quote-unquote proof that these creatures exist is he cites examples of the saints encountering these creatures, and he basically says, well, the saints encountered these creatures and the saints never lie. See, obviously these creatures are real. Like, he basically quote-unquote proved his theories in this book by basically stating that his religion is never wrong. Like, that's kind of how he proves his theories in this book. So once again, he very much went into this with a predetermined outcome, but it's still a fascinating book, and I do recommend it. But yeah, that was my review on Demoniality, or Incubi and Succubi by Father Sinistrari, and bye.